So what nonviolence is, I know most of you will already know this, but just for anybody who doesn't know, this is my very quick way of expressing what nonviolence is. And it's a bit like tuning a stringed musical instrument. So this is a picture of a lute, which is where the idea came from. The Buddha was talking about the strings of a lute in relation to meditation. So it's true for nonviolence that the strings need adjusting to get the right kind of tension. And with nonviolence, tension is tightened by confrontation. We need confrontation. So nonviolence isn't a passive thing. We need to sometimes cause disruption, be civilly disobedient in order to get our voices heard. But we don't want the strings to be too tight, so we also ease the tension by our care, by our respect for other people, and by our general intention to act for the good of society and for the earth. So what makes the music is not too tight and not too slack. And got a lovely picture of a cheeky looking person playing a lute. Hope you enjoy that. So this is 3 planets to explain the 3 main areas that I want to explain and make clear to you. On the one hand, we've got the planet Violent, which is full of tyrants and aggressive people. And then we've got Not Being Violent, which is this default position that I'll be explaining a bit more about later on. And then we've got non-violence, which is something else entirely. It's not something in between those two. It's something that kind of is almost stepping out of the frame. But the important thing is that each of these planets have a gravitational pull, and so they accrue certain characteristics towards them. And I'll be explaining what these different characteristics are, I think, in the next slide. Yeah, that's it. So, on planet Violence, we've got power over. We've got this idea of one truth, which is my truth. I'm sure that will be familiar to lots of you. And we've got someone who's narcissistic or monstrous in some way. Donald Trump comes to mind. Threat and posturing, force without any attention to justice, all kinds of falsehood and lack of trust, manipulation and so on, and then disdain for anyone that isn't part of the world they want to create. So probably disdain for diversity. Then we've got Not Being Violent, which is when the strings of the lute are too slack. So with this one, we've got powerlessness as opposed to power over. There's a kind of void of truth. That people are kind of disengaged and a bit indifferent to what's happening. There's a kind of flatness or flaccidness. That people are compliant and obedient because they have no power to be anything else. And of course, finally, they're apathetic. They're not up for doing very much. So these, I should also say that these characteristics are the extreme. I'm speaking in extreme terms at the moment. Later on, we'll go into some milder versions of these as they might manifest in the streets. So now we go to non-violence, which is what makes the music. So here we've got power with each other, and also power within. There's a kind of, almost a spiritual sense of groundedness or a psychological sense of groundedness within. Instead of one truth, you've got different perspectives on many truths and looking at all of them, entertaining the different possibilities. We've got engagement with the community and solidarity with diverse communities, care and respect for everyone. Non-violence challenges obedience, so it involves confrontation, as I said before, it's not passive, and that confrontation intends to expose injustice. And because of the accountability and transparency of the way we do things, there's also a sense of us being able to be trusted. And finally, humility is very key to it. It may also be, you might be familiar with the idea of tactical nonviolence or principled nonviolence. So principled nonviolence is partly people drawing from faith and wisdom traditions or just on their principles. And of course, tactical nonviolence can be principled as well, but it has much more of a kind of heady, rational kind of tactical approach. So both are completely valid, and XR tends to focus more on tactical because it's more inclusive of people who don't follow a particular faith. Okay, next slide. So now we're going to look at how all these relate to each other. This is a bit of a complicated image, but I'm going to talk you through. So you've got the three planets, violence and not being violent and non-violent. And there's still this gravitational pull between within each planet. But there's also a trajectory, which you'll see with the blue line that goes up either side from non-violence. And it's a trajectory that goes a long way out beyond my slide. So I've put a dotted line to show that. And there's another gravitational pull that is constantly pulling us from the non-violence position into either violence or not being violent. So this is what we're working against all of the time. And at the far end, you've got of violence, you've got fascism and tyranny. At the far end of not being violent, when all else, you know, when you become completely flaccid and impotent, you just become oppressed. So that's the far end. What I'm interested in exploring with you now is more at this further end. So we've got not being violent category, we've got charities, and then we've also got campaigning groups that are much more towards the non-violence end of things. I've got a dotted line between them and the oppressed to indicate that that's a long way off. So they're all at the near end. And then on the other side, on the violent side, we've got what you may have heard this term, by any means necessary. So these are grassroots activists who believe that we need more than non-violence, that non-violence isn't going to take us where we need to go. And there's quite a range. You might know of some groups that follow these principles, but at the extreme end, or further up the line, as it were, on the trajectory, you've got the weathermen of the 60s who use bombs and fire and all sorts of stuff. There's also the Red Army faction from Germany, who use some pretty extreme methods as well. But they were all in the interests of social change. So they shared many of our aims. So, you know, we can see them as, in a sense, distant allies, or maybe uncomfortable allies. And then you've also got groups like Earth First, who are using much milder, by any means necessary methods, and the Black Bloc you might have heard of as well. So that's, I've called them BAM for short, because they go BAM. And then on the other side, we've got a whole list of groups that lean towards, in some way, lean towards by any means necessary. So they are actually on the not being violent side of things, but they're a little, you know, perhaps over time have moved a bit closer towards by any means necessary. And because it's a triangle between the three planets, you see that as it gets closer to non-violence, it becomes easier to kind of slip over to the other side, as it were. So the first example, the Suffragettes. So you may have heard of them as being non-violent, but actually they did have a by any means necessary component. And something that we used to talk about around the fire at Greenham Common many years ago was a saying which goes, the hand that rocks the cradle, i.e. the mothers, cradles the rock. So you've got suffragettes throwing rocks, breaking windows, using fire and arson and so on. I don't know what this image does for you. Maybe you feel appalled by it, but I invite you to entertain the possibility of being seduced by it. Maybe you feel pretty angry now, and maybe you feel a sense of we should have turned a corner by now. The government should have gone further. So I want to invite you to just feel yourself being seduced by this image of wanting to be drawn towards using more, possibly more serious. Perhaps this might be more effective. The suffragettes won their cause. Maybe this is an effective way forward. Let yourself be seduced. And then now we'd return to the other slide. So we've got the suffragettes. We've got the anti-globalization movement, which began in Seattle, was non-violent against incredible odds of rubber bullets and tear gas and pepper spray, and became influenced by by any means necessary people, by the Black Bloc, who were also present, but much more in the periphery on agreement. And so they weren't amongst everybody else. And things started to move over in that direction. And the word non-violence was dropped, and the people who were inclined towards non-violence fell into this default position of just not being violent. So the edge of non-violence was lost. And a similar thing happened with climate, with the anti-roads movement of the 90s. Started off pretty non-violent. It would claim to be non-violent. And then as time went on, it started to move more and more over towards the by any means necessary camp, ending with a massive fire at Newbury Bypass, but with machines and buildings set on fire. And after that, the movement sort of petered out. Likewise with the anti-globalization movement, it petered out after several big actions in different cities. There've been some more successful manifestations, like the GM crop pullers of the 90s and the noughties. Were using covertness, so there was no extreme violence used, just being covert rather than being accountable. And that kind of worked better because there was good communication, or some communication, between the covert activists and the accountable activists. Actually, communication wasn't always that good, but it was good enough to create quite a good, significant victory. And then we've got the climate camp, which gradually morphed into Reclaim the Power, which I've put in that camp because they don't refer to themselves as non-violent. They don't have it on their website. They don't claim it in their press releases and so on, in the way that XR does. So that brings us to non-violence, and perhaps the key thing that defines them from these other two groups is that we name, claim and frame our actions as non-violent. So we have it in our literature, we have it on the website, we have the Rebel Agreement, we claim our actions to the media as being non-violent, and we frame them on the street as non-violent by using this idea of the non-violent container. So we create this atmosphere that is conducive to holding those characteristics that I explained from the other slide, the respect and the humility, and inducing calm and so on. So that's what marks us out as very different to groups like those who are leaning towards BAM, which otherwise wouldn't, they're not so different from us. They're not so far away from us. And I've drawn a dotted line between these two by any means necessary and leaning towards those groups leaning towards BAM. And at this dotted line is diversity of tactics. So this is how it manifests. It will either try to link up with groups that are already leaning towards them, or it will link into groups that are non-violent and when their methods appear, the non-violent container gets diluted, and the edge of non-violence, the non-violent confrontation, tends to get reduced to this not being violent. So that's how that works. We'll move on now to look at some of the characteristics of these two groups, focusing on the by any means necessary and the group on the not being violent side. So there's this great quote from Einstein, I don't know if you know it: "The world is a dangerous place to live, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it." So I've taken this and used this to describe the people who are more towards the non-violent end of not being violent, and called them the good people who are not doing enough. And then on the other side, we've got the by any means necessary people who want to employ diversity of tactics. So in the circle, I've got, what does it, I've asked the question, what does it feel like to be these people? So to be a good person not doing enough. These are concerned people. They're concerned about what's happening in the world. They have a sense of nervous disease, perhaps, but they're rather passive, or they might be involved in a campaigning group. They might be a member of a campaigning group. So I'm looking at quite a wide range now. People who maybe give money to charity and so on. And then on the other side, we've got by any means necessary. I can hear an echo. Is there a technical problem? Okay. On the by any means necessary side, we've got people who are probably acting out of a sense of desperation, a desperation at the place that we find ourselves in in the world today, with climate change, with the political situation, and with mass extinction of species. There is good reason to be desperate, to be aggressive, perhaps angry, and fearful for what we might lose, what your children might lose, and also to feel outraged. So those are all feelings that we might also feel and identify with. We also might at times feel that we'd rather just be comfortable and give our money to Greenpeace or something and just be a member. Most of us will have times when we have our feet in either of those camps to some degree. So with the by any means necessary folk, you've got on the top of the list, we've got militant rebellion, and then it gets milder as it goes down the list. So we've got pushy, edgy, covert, seeking to take power. We've got confrontation, which is also present with non-violence. And we've got acting in solidarity with the oppressed. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, is there? An emphasis on tactics. And also that these are people who are passionate and energetic and have a lot of commitment. And I kind of associate it with a kind of hero archetype, of somebody who's trying to save the planet. And finally, that it's kind of sexy, if you look at it, if you look back to that image of the woman throwing the rock, there is something quite alluring to that image if you're feeling really up against it with what's happening on the planet. So on the other side, we've got passivity, we've got deferring to power, we've got people who mean well. They mean well, but they shrink from rocking the boat. And maybe the stereotype is that they're rather worthy. How am I doing for time? Not too bad. Also, key to this is that they're obedient. So this is really significant. So this is perhaps what most marks us out from campaigning groups, who are otherwise doing something very similar. That they're obedient, they're compliant in some way. We're breaking the rules, we're breaking the law, or we're in some way challenging obedience. So we had that in the previous slide. So let's see, let's move on now to look more at diversity of tactics. So this is this relationship between the by any means necessary people and the people who may be slightly influenced by or feel somewhat seduced by using more edgy kind of methods or more provocative methods. But also we're looking at people who are, you know, who are non-violent. We're perhaps looking at a situation for XR on the streets when some people come in, some people from the Black Bloc or from other movements that want things to be a bit more edgy, and want to create this line of diversity of tactics, this range from by any means necessary through to what they want to call non-violence. So they want non-violence to be present on this spectrum, and they want the whole range from by any means necessary to what they call non-violence to be within one action or one movement. That's their kind of strategy, if you like. But what happens with this is that as soon as you get any kind of well, certainly militancy, but anything that's a bit provocative or a bit edgy, non-violence tends to lose its power, and it reverts to this default not being violent, which is passive and ineffective. Non-violence partly draws its strength from being sensitive and subtle, but that also means that it can be quite fragile and vulnerable. So when we don't have that non-violent container as a kind of protection or a buffer, there is this kind of tendency or danger to slide into not being violent. I should also say that diversity of tactic strategies are not necessarily militant. Very often they're just wanting to raise the tension in some way. But they tend to want to raise it in a way that's too tight for non-violence. And it tends to, they might not be their intention, but it tends to create a container that actually supports the by any means necessary tactics. So they might thrive in that container, which is exactly the reason why we as de-escalators are doing our best to create this non-violent container. So all of this shows the importance of naming, claiming and framing what we do as non-violent. So we name it in all our literature, we claim it to the press, and we frame our actions as non-violent in as many possible ways that we can on the street, by using music and theatre, by beauty being present, by friendliness and warmth and people being calm and all of that. One of the reasons why, well, another reason why diversity of tactics is a problem to us is that the police often take advantage when things get a bit edgy. They can take advantage of this and inject agents provocateurs because they know that non-violence is less effective in that kind of environment. So by injecting agents provocateurs to stir things up a bit, they know that they weaken our strength of non-violence. And also to say that diversity of tactics actually does rely on the presence of people not being violent, or people who are trying to be non-violent but end up being not being violent. But it tends to alienate them so that they end up sliding towards passivity. So a typical situation would be that Black Bloc arrive at a non-violent action, whip the crowd up in some way, create a lot of tension. People who are perhaps new to direct action see all this and think, I don't like this, this isn't what I thought XR was about. They then become alienated and they think, oh, well, I'll just go back to, paying my membership to Friends of the Earth, or, giving money to charity or something. So they slide back towards passivity. And finally, to remind you, non-violence is about making music. So wishing everybody a successful rebellion.